Welcome to Fempower Health. This is Georgie. AI is everywhere. It's in our apps, it's in our doctor's offices, and even in the tools we use at home. But here's the problem. If we don't get women's health data right, AI could make the gaps even worse. That's why I sat down with Dr. Nikita Patel, a pharmacist, biomedical engineer, and healthcare innovation leader who knows this space inside and out. We cut through the hype and we talk about why AI is only as good as the data behind it, what this means for women trying to advocate for themselves, and how we can build a future where technology actually closes the health gap instead of widening it. This is a conversation every woman and everyone building in healthcare needs to hear. And I'll be honest, parts of it stopped me in my tracks. So listen in, and if this resonates, share it with a friend, because the more of us who understand what's really at stake, the more power we have to shape what happens next. Niki, welcome to the Fempower Health podcast. It is so nice to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here as well.
I have had AI is all the rage right now, and we hear that there's like this unique lens that we need to have in women's health when it comes to AI. So this is such an important conversation because AI is being added to apps. It is everywhere. And so could women's health be at risk here, right? And so I think that's what a lot of people are saying. And so that's really why we need to have this conversation. So first, let's talk about this buzzword and how, from your perspective, what is really misunderstood right now about AI's role in healthcare?
I really like that question, and I'm so glad you bring it up early as well. Someone coming from an AI background, to me, AI in healthcare still refers to data. That's my mindset. Everything that AI does, everything that it's built on, is always going to be dependent on data. AI enables you to understand that data in different ways. It enables you to package it in different ways. And in the vision of healthcare, that's both insights into your health and conversational elements in health with things like LLMs. So for me, it's a growing space in healthcare, but it's still maybe got some levers that need to be optimized to be properly and safely used in healthcare as well.
And when you were saying the word data, it reminds me. So my ex-husband is a quant guy. He works in finance and he is data. And I believe it was him and a few others that have also reiterated this, where it's like, we've kind of had AI for way longer than people think, and that it's a buzzword now. Can you just educate us on that, please?
So, AI is a really broad, overarching term, but it stems down, like he said, to data. I have to agree with him there. It's how you use the data and how you use code to make educational, clear insights from that data. So, for example, if you gave me a big puddle of information, huge number of people's information, say their healthcare information, AI, the first thing I could do is clean up this data, put it in a nice structure, get the same pieces of information for everybody and structure it. Then I could use AI to say, okay, I want to gain insights. What are the patterns I'm seeing with these people? Doing the machine learning, doing the data insights, and then growing that into what we now typically term AI, which is usually a large language model. I think we've kind of coined those two phrases together, but AI is so much bigger for everything from bringing in the data, cleaning it up, understanding the patterns, and then communicating those patterns back to people in an accessible way. So that's my branch approach to this is AI.
Got it. That makes sense. So what would you say, maybe if we were to say practical terms, what couldn't we do before that we can do now? Is it just that the technology is simply getting better?
Absolutely. And there's also a different view for how we use this information. Previously, it was just like, I want a graph, here's an insight. Now we're looking at ways to, well, what can this predict for us? There wasn't necessarily that application, particularly in healthcare previously. And also packaging it for accessibility. It was usually only people with high threshold information, deep access to these things that had the information that we needed. Now it's on a broader scale where everyone can access it and have this information at their fingertips. I think that's the biggest change in how we now all view AI versus the folks that were there maybe at the genesis of AI.
Like the quant guys in finance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And I agree with you. The accessibility is key. And I use it quite a bit. And it's amazing, like even in the past year, how much better the large language models have gotten. So, but now let's take this into women's health. How does this fit into the broader conversations? And does it really require a distinct lens?
I love that question because I'm going to work backwards. So you think of something like the current, more well-known large language learning models, ChatGPT, etc., and I'll start framing it there. They typically look at everything you can find in terms of data to give you an answer, which, is fantastic for general questions. But then we look at things like, well, what does it access if I ask it a question about women's health? It's such a broad pool, but it's such a shallow pool of information as well. We don't have the depth of research. We don't have the depth of studies that are specifically for women. So this distinct lens then becomes, okay, why don't we look at proper women's health data that's collected and factually validated, rather than using something like ChatGPT, which has all this information and kind of dilutes the point a little bit for us? I think this is where the specific lens truly comes in. We need the more focused women's health data and the focus on women's health in these LLMs to give us truer, more accurate, and more relevant answers to the questions that you may have in women's health as well.
So when you say that, I think, well, if ChatGPT, as an example, and other large language models are taking all of this data, right? Why do we need something specifically designed for women's health? Because I would think, well, they're taking all the data. So wouldn't they have elements of women's health data as well? So help us understand why there needs to be a difference.
So this is a little bit in the way that they work as well. What they're trying to do is cast the widest net of information. And that can sometimes end up combining men's health studies and things that are inferred about men's health into women's health. So what you're working on is a core data set that's not really women's health, that takes in things like, oh, well, if I factor it and change it just a little bit, it should apply to women. But it's not actually women's health data necessarily. It's adjustments on men's health for women's health, which often misses the mark because we all function quite differently at this point. So I think there's the need for depth and focus on women's health. And another element is you have so much vast information. It's not always specific, and sometimes it's not always accurate. So if you're pulling from sources that are maybe opinions, not just clinical research, and you have forums where this is discussed, all that information is being pulled in. And sometimes it's a bit contradictory. So the model thinks, well, which one's right? I'll take a best guess approach and say, I think this one fits the question that I've been asked, as opposed to this is the most factual piece of information that applies. I think that's where I see this real need for proper women's health data and maybe a bit more focus of the LLMs on that, ones that are trained specifically on it and have the right information in the right structure.
As you're describing this, I'm thinking of people navigating the healthcare system and feeling like the care that they receive is generic. It's almost like the way you were describing the AI experience within a large language model. It's almost like if we don't get this right for women's health, we're going to redo what we have as a lived experience within our own technology. It's like a double reinforcement of frustration, right?
Exactly. It could only enable to widen the gap.
Yep, exactly. Because, so I've been interviewing experts for the past 6 years in all these women's health topics. And I feel like I know how to advocate for myself because I've had like hundreds of hours of interviews and many, many books that I've read. So I feel like I have like a women's health specific large language model in my brain that I can pull from as needed. But what I've learned through these interviews is if you don't know the right question to ask or the right thing to remember about yourself to share with your doctor, it's really hard. So I could now taking that into these large language models, if you're now that it's accessible, if you're even an individual woman who is trying to query, if you don't know the exact way to query, you're going to be facing the exact same thing that you're facing in the healthcare system.
That's exactly it. I think the power of AI here, where it could be used in the interim while women's health data does grow, is asking the questions about how do I advocate for myself? How can I package what I know about myself, what I've learned about women's health, maybe through reading articles, even through asking, large language models as well. How do I take this to a clinician to get them to best understand what I need? This is something I think AI could be really powerful for, especially in women's health, because from my generation, even I know we've never really been taught to advocate, question, or actually bring extra information into medical appointments or health appointments. It's very much go in, here's your symptoms, here's your treatment, off you go. You feel very pressured in that 15 minutes and you don't want to overstep by asking questions. But you really should, because it enables you to learn more. And even if it's just the seed to learn more, you can then go to these language models and suddenly ask more relevant questions, the right questions to get you to the next level in taking control of your health.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Would you say that, because what I guess I just want to clarify is, are you saying people can do that effectively now, or ideally they should be able to, but we have probably a long way to go to make sure it's effective for people?
I think the latter. It
Okay.
needs to be more effective.
Okay, but it's definitely something possible. Now, you work with
Exactly.
so many different businesses, and obviously, I originally started Fempower Health as a way for women to hear from the quote unquote the 10th doctor, because it took me 10 doctors to figure out why I couldn't get pregnant. So I kind of always say I look for the 10th doctor to interview for every women's health topic so that you can hear from those experts so you can
Hmm.
advocate for yourself, right?
Yeah.
But through that, what's been interesting is businesses who are interested in women's health listen to the episode. Clinicians really take this because the degree at which we cover these topics and the level at which we cover them are of interest. And so I'm really grateful that this has gone broader than I would have ever imagined. And so, we just talked about like individual patients doing queries and things like that. But when it comes to businesses and healthcare providers and others, I mean, you do a lot of consulting with businesses as well. What additional perspective do we need to add in here about the impact of the models being where they are now versus where we need them to be specific to women?
I'll tackle that in two stages. Number one is just if I was looking at AI use in a clinical setting, for example. I think AI is still not built for clinical in general, independent of men's and women's health. And the reason is it's not built with systems thinking. And to elaborate on that a little bit, the AI in clinical settings right now is almost like an automation of a textbook. You have all the standardized knowledge. You have case notes, which usually go by standard clinical models, but nothing that's truly emerging in this space or looking at real world evidence trends. Now, some people are just starting to build this in, and there's some great upcoming tools in the clinical space for this, but it's still very much a textbook symptom to treatment approach. I think the next layer that needs to be built in for both men's, women's health, and just health in general needs to be connecting the dots between systems. Sometimes in, for example, women's health, we look at fertility independently of things like thyroid health, but the two are actually incredibly interlinked. And it's the need to create a data set that shows that and creates those linkages. And then the AI can be trained in such a way that it knows, oh, look, I should look for these other things in addition to the core question that's been asked. I understand how they're all linked. And now I can give you a really well thought out response to a potential question or a series of test inputs that you have, or even symptoms that people come in with. That to me is how it should be built for clinical. I think the caveats around that is there'll always be pushback in the clinical setting. purely because there's a black box element to AI. And I advocate strongly for any AI being used in a clinical setting to have two things: transparency on how it got to the response, what it used to get there, and why it made that decision. And number two is human in the loop. I don't think we're ready to just purely rely on AI in the clinic. I think there's room for human in the loop that's going to create stronger models, more well thought out models, and more accurate answers with personalization.
I guess I'm just thinking about these systems thinking, because this is also the area that it's like, as a consultant with my background, this is what I do, is like the systems of how companies operate. So I completely hear you. And what's interesting is last night I had a meeting with the World Endometriosis Society because I'm putting together an endometriosis working group, future name to be determined, but it's really the systems thinking with endometriosis. And a couple of things that I'm thinking, just to, have like a concrete example on a disease, adding to what you had said about like the thyroid disease and fertility tie. But here, this is something now within a disease, another systems piece, which is one, who are the experts that are advising companies on what they are building and the research they're doing, and having investors trust in who is validating that. And then one of the concerns they expressed is, are the studies complete enough before things go to market? And additionally, what research has already been done versus the research gap, and coordinating all of that?
I want to say it's unusual, but being on the other side of it, just like you are, that's the tip of the iceberg of the questions that we have. Because when you think it through, there's so many unknowns that still need to be answered, need to be thought through, and need to be connected. You suddenly realize, well, okay, if I'm looking at this from an AI or asking a question perspective, who is able to answer me? And that's the best way to highlight the gap, is who can answer this question. As we go to create solutions, what we're finding is essentially more and more gaps that we need to be able to understand to create something automated to also provide that information to people as well. And it shines a light on how little we've progressed in terms of particularly women's health research. It feels very overlooked when you go for a deeper dive. And just like you said, one small example, one specific disease area in women's health, and look how many gaps you've already found. It's astounding.
Yep. No, absolutely. And, there's gaps in men's health as well, and
Of
all of
course.
healthcare. So here's a question for you then. And this could be a last question, but I'm having such anxiety about it that I have to ask it now, and then we'll continue, because I wonder if others are having anxiety about this too, which is, there's this fear that I have and many have expressed, which is, if we don't understand that the data with women's health specifically is so far behind, if we don't fix it ASAP, we're messed up for the future. Like, is that really how it works? Because it almost seems like the way people have been talking about it is, we need to correct everything quickly, because if we don't, the further and further we get into the advancement of AI, the more and more lost the things that are unique to the health of women will get negatively impacted to a greater degree. Is that true? Or is that unnecessary alarmist behavior? Because I don't know how the data sets are built. So I'd love to get your perspective on how much we should be concerned about this.
So I think there is a need for fairly swift action, but I believe that there's also the room to course correct. And let me put that in context. I'm going to use a standard LLM as an example again, or forever being the engineer in me. Imagine you ask it a question about women's health, and it comes back with I don't know, or here's my best guess answer. Everything that it outputs, every question that you ask, is used to actually train it. So what you're doing essentially by responding to the answer it gives you, either positively or negatively, is telling it, yep, pop this back into your training set. Feel free to use it again if a similar question ever comes up. It's a well thought out response. People reacted really well to it. Or you've got obviously the opposite. No, this is not the answer they wanted. Let's take it out of the training set. Let's provide them a different answer and start to gauge that reaction. Now, if we put that in the context of women's health, and there's a data gap, and it provides a response that's an adapted men's health study or general population study that's not quite the perfect fit, but it's an adapted fit, and someone responds positively, suddenly you've diluted the factual women's health data because you've popped this adjusted response back into the training set, and it said, great, next time someone asks a question in this women's health category, this is a good enough answer. So it won't go back and ever double search and say what's a more relevant, what's a more correct, what's a more aligned answer until enough people have said, no, I disagree with your answer, go and find me something more relevant. So I think that's the time trade-off between we need the answers now. As a woman, I'd love the answers right now. But from an AI perspective, we have to have a balance of making sure the data is correctly collected and correctly interpreted, but also fed into the AI in a way that we don't dilute what we're putting in. We can have this amazing brand new research and insights, but by putting it into the AI, it's already diluted itself into giving the answers.
Wow. Okay. Good to know. So this makes me think now about research and development. And there's this Ambien case study, right? Which, by the way, I have dug into, and I still am not 100% clear where we fully landed on the men versus women dose. But for those who don't know, years ago, there was concern about the dosage of Ambien for men versus women. And there were all sorts of car accidents and sleepwalking and sleep sex and all of these things where people would be doing things in the middle of the night and not remembering them in the morning. And there turns out, actually, there was going to be I believe, shorter acting formulation, which then brought about discussions with the FDA. And they went back and tried to assess what's going on. Is it dosing? And so they did some smaller studies. But when you look at them, some have gone back and said the studies, the way they did them, weren't necessarily as accurate, but they couldn't really come up with a reason why all of these different things were happening to people. So the best they could guess was it was men versus women. Like they tried to adjust for weight, they tried to adjust for these things. And so then it came to women should take half the dose. And since then, I've tried to find information. So again, limited data. And I've really tried to put the pieces together. And based on my own queries, I haven't been able to get a perfect answer. But, throughout history, there's been a lot of things around how data is assessed and how we should be thinking ahead on how clinical trials should be run. And then there's mice studies, the way male versus female mice behave and how men and women as humans behave, and just all of these dynamics that come into play. I would love for R&D to say, when we run these clinical trials and we need to understand how they work in different populations, how can we optimally run them? I think that's a very important query. And I'm curious if we're even there yet, because do we even have the base data? Because again, for those who don't know, 1993 is when the FDA mandated women partake in clinical trials. How do we understand even the treatments that are being researched and then commercialized and marketed to humans? How much do we know about how they impact different subpopulations?
I love that you touched on this. It appeals to the pharmacist in me and the former farmer in me as well. So I completely identify. I've read the previous studies and the rationale behind getting to the point to get women in trials. I couldn't agree more. I know I get the feeling of your sentiment, and I could not agree more. It's a little shocking. So for me, I would say from this point in time, trials are already less than optimally designed. The way that they're designed is to ensure that you can either have a yes or no outcome without too much variation in your population. You're very, very focused on answering the question. So you cut out as much of the noise as possible to be able to say, we have or have not answered the question around dosing. I feel that there's scope for that to be changed, and it should be changed in different layers. I think layer number one, which from the last time I did work directly with pharma is coming in, is modeling. So what we need to do is have physiological or human body type models where we understand, okay, what's the pathway of this drug? And to tie that into Ambien, looking at how it's metabolized, for example, and broken down in the body between different genders, between different weights, between different races is a really good starting point. If you understand how it's broken down, is it broken down differently across these populations? If so, why? How much of the active form of it that, causes all these side effects remains? How long does it remain for? Having the data to be able to do that in an automated way rather than human trials, I think is the biggest first step. You start to understand what these drugs do, what the structure means, and the nuances of it, because you understand how different people work. I think the next layer then comes in that's often overlooked, which is environment. We often don't factor in clinical trials, and a lot of time in AI prompts, we're missing this context as well of, say I put results in and said, my cortisol was extremely high today. I didn't tell the AI, am I male or female? I didn't tell it my age. I didn't tell it my stress status. I didn't tell it what supplements I take. I didn't tell it my medical history. None of that context is there. And I think sometimes, I think more often than not, that's also something that we miss, both in clinical trials as contextualizing the results and then with data. And that's where I said making those connections and data to feed the AI in a more informed way. That's something we can also, should also layer in to get deeper and more relevant results. It's also something that we can do when it comes to prompting. Avoid giving personal information because it's always going to be stored and used, but you can ask a question or a prompt in a more contextualized way, not just, is this an answer? I need to know this. Give it a little bit of context and see how it feeds back.
Okay. That's very helpful. It's interesting. I'm curious with the AI, because I know right now a lot of pharma is trying to use AI to identify molecules. But I see, and I don't know how much they're using it to design clinical trials, but I know that, I know there's a lot of criticism of the industry. I've worked in it my entire career. I think everything can always be better, but there's a lot of reasons why the whole industry, not just biopharma, is the way it is. And we have to look at reimbursement. We could probably do an assessment of each of the stakeholders in healthcare and figuring out how we can apply AI. Maybe that's another episode to do down in the future. But I more just want to at least say, all of these factors come into play, even how the FDA understands a given disease and the requirements for FDA approval, and that also will drive the whole R&D planning. And I know one of the things that pharma really needs to take into account is the cost and speed of clinical trials and the ability to enroll patients, which also adds an added layer. And I'm curious if AI, especially if queried this way, great, if they can use AI for drug development, great, but clinical trial design can definitely be an optimization here, right?
Oh, I couldn't agree more, because you've got this wide history of studies that it has access to. So you could query it to say, what's the optimal study design if I am looking for this, and this for this particular class of therapeutic? You can be very generic, but what you have, which you wouldn't have without AI, is a wide breadth of information. Whereas if you're 1 to 2 people planning a study, you're very limited to what you can find and what you can work with. Now you're working from a small research pool of studies that you can use to create this study clinical trial plan to the absolute breadth of everything that's ever been published and is accessible. And, that gives you insights. What can I add to the trial? How can I optimize the design? What's been done before? Now you have this stack and you can really rank it and say, these trials were stellar because they covered the points I wanted. They had variation. They had great outcomes. They had great data populations with representation. I want to do my study like this. Does it make sense? I think it's an extremely powerful tool with that application.
Yeah. But I do like what you were saying on how we also, as they're running the trials, need to understand what is going on with the patients. Another one is Dr. Jerry Lynn Pryor, who I've had on the podcast many, many times. Another criticism she has about a lot of clinical trials is they don't even talk about if a woman is on birth control. They don't even assess that. And so there's all these layers. And I know right now they're looking at, I don't think they use the term anymore, but earlier in my career, they would call them phase 4 trials. So up until FDA approval, it's the phase 3 trial. And then once it's in market, that's when you start to kind of have more the real world evidence of what's happening in real life. What I've been really trying to do as I evolve Fempower Health is it's so important for me to help people understand like what goes on behind the scenes, because I think there's so much frustration and finger pointing. And I agree every stakeholder can do better, but it's not one stakeholder. And even as women, we need to learn how to better advocate and not just show up to the doctor to say, hey, why haven't you healed me? And the doctor's like, because you told me nothing, right? Like you can't just show up and me know your entire life history for the past 12 months and your annual visit and suddenly I can magically heal you. And so, it's really important for me to, and people may want different levels of detail and I totally respect that. But I think just understanding these dynamics are so important. So you mentioned sharing your personal information and privacy. It's a big thing with AI, and this obviously isn't specific to women's health. This is just general. So I think all of us have this question. So how is it that we should be doing these queries? And as all of these different stakeholders, our clinicians, us as ourselves going through these large language models and entering information, what really is happening behind the scenes and what should we be careful of and monitoring?
I'll use myself as an example because I've done this data pipeline before with prompting. For me, I typically err on the side of caution of giving out what would be considered personal information. Obviously,
Okay.
we know it from pre-AI that it's still, if you give it away, it's accessible and not great things can follow on from it. So I tend to apply that rule when prompting. What I've done previously is look at what constitutes personal information or personally identifiable information. What can be traced back to me? If I erase that, I can really create some good questions that don't lose any of the context, but also protect me as an individual. And, I'd encourage everyone to do that. I think it's the standard tenets of, maybe if you don't have to give your date of birth, don't do so. Don't give out your address. Don't give out anything that can personally be traced back to you in any way, shape, or form. So, for example, if I was to write a query about myself and say my health in this context as well, I'd say, I am a 37-year-old woman of Indian origin living in the UK. I have high cortisol levels. Here's my results. I have high glucose. Here's my results. I'd like to understand why. That's usually a great generic starting point. And that's the safest way to keep your data. I haven't identified who I am. A location, yep, very generic. An age, yep, very generic. Descent, yep, very generic.
Okay.
But I've still given enough information to get the answer that I need that's personalized or at least looked at in terms of data that's specific to who I am.
Okay.
Always err on the side of caution.
Okay. No, that makes sense. But what about our emails are attached to them? So how is it that they can't attach it to us if our email is there?
I've got no answer for that one. Once you link an account, that's under the terms and conditions, you've signed yourself away a little bit.
Okay. No, that's
but I
fair.
think there are guardrails as to how much you give and how frequently you give it as well.
Okay. No, that's fair. So another question is, so many companies now are using AI apps. There's a lot of companies, like even there's actually several companies that I know who are doing women's health specific AI. So based on what you've seen in the industry, I'd love to better understand what we should, because based on everything you're sharing, there's like so much advancement that needs to be happening. So what's the reality of what the current, even women's health specific AI tools out there can do? And are they really specific to women's health, so to speak?
That's a really good question. I've seen quite a few pop up lately. I'll start with maybe the AI in the women's health testing space and the diagnostic space. I think those are fantastic data gathering tools to add to women's health. They're factual, they're clear, they show you in and out of range, and they have this information that goes with it. So, for example, they have your profile, and they take that without your personal information, of course, but they can create this map of, okay, this person as a data point fits in here. This is what we saw. This is the clinical result we have. We have the data, we have the evidence, we have the changes that happened over time using these tests. So that's one really great path, because if you think about it coming backwards as a data set, if I was to go in and ask them, hey, I want to know what would happen with me. Great. We're going to go and look up women who are approximately your age in our cohort. We're going to look up women who align with your heritage and ethnic history and race. We're going to look at women who have got similar, maybe lifestyle habits, circumstances, prescribing trends and supplements. And now we can kind of have this predictive level of, oh, yeah, okay, we could see this happening for you. So that's the great forward and back of that very definitive data set. In terms of asking more open-ended questions and content in things like LLMs, there's great groundwork for this. So if we're using content that's created, for women's health specifically, we've got almost an undiluted platform of data that can be fed into a women's health LLM. What we're missing is all those additional data pieces. So I don't think we're bust. I think we're laying the foundation to build upon it. And I think something that would be great to see in this space is maybe pooling and aggregating that data, because we're all ultimately building to the same goal, which is empowering women's health. But if we put our heads together and our data sets together, you could build something that's so female health specific that answers so many people's questions without this dilution of, potentially factoring from men's health.
Interesting. So I guess, can you dive a bit more into this? Because, I'm thinking of so for the content piece, how do we know that it's the right content as we're doing these queries? Because I'm going back to the very beginning of our conversation, which is who's sharing the information? Is it the right person that is sharing it? Because I even think about my podcast. Like if you took my transcripts and put them all into an LLM, things have changed over time, right? So if you literally made my podcast an LLM, I would even say we would need to layer in all the latest research to update any of the queries. We'd have to validate what is scientifically proven based on a given guest that I interviewed. So that's just even within my own podcast. And I vet the experts, and sometimes I disagree with the things they share, but yeah,
yeah.
Right. So I'd love to paint this picture. And I agree with you. Maybe the conclusion is we just all need to put our heads together.
I think there's a lot to be said for data filtering and setting the quality levels of your data. This can absolutely be done, using automation tools, not necessarily AI, automation plus human in the loop. This is a great case study for it. What do you want it to inform? What's the baseline? Number 2, what are the sources that came with this? Part 2A, Part 2B. Where did those sources come from? Who is the work sponsored by? Are they validated? Are they vetted? Have they been reviewed? Who have they been reviewed by? Are they legitimate sources of information? So if I was to build this pipeline, for example, for women's health, in terms of just screening all of the data that goes into it to say, am I happy with this? From a content perspective, I would probably put the most rigorous rules on there, because content can sometimes be fed with bias of an opinion, an experience, which is perfectly valid. And it absolutely has its place in an LLM, because it could be a great identifier with somebody who's looking in this space. But I would want it to stick to the core facts. So number 1 would be a very high pass filter for something like content, which is very prone to bias. Understanding the bias. Where does the bias come from? Trying to mitigate that. This is a problem across all the AI models independent of women's health. Number 2 is things like numerical ranges, studies, anything that's an outcome of a study. If I was to build it, I would say number one, is the study valid? How many people are in this study? What's the power of the study? What's it investigating? Is it a fair comparison? And what are the outcomes? Is it relevant to my audience? Who sponsored this study? Because that can really create bias. And thirdly, if you put this into an AI engine, you're kind of thinking, when someone publishes a study, it's rarely definitive. Scientists love to speak, and I know this because I've published papers myself. We rarely want to commit to saying it's good or bad or either way. We just kind of state the outcome of the study and say that's our conclusion.
Yes.
That's why studies are so open to being inferred in so many different ways, depending on who reads it and what they take the outcome to be, what they take the meaning of the study to be. I think that's where you have to be really rigorous and have a very multidisciplinary team type of approach, which kind of culls the bias that can come in if it was just one person interpreting the study. Use all those specialty skill sets and have them all kind of come together and say, I agree. I think this is the conclusion with as best alignment as you can get. Otherwise, you're just layering on your own bias into this LLM.
Yep. No, absolutely.
And I think just to add to that is also diagnostic ranges. I think there's so much variability in how clinical values are also interpreted when you put things in like test and health metrics. It's eliminating the bias or creating standardization with context. So that would be my big 3 layers of how do we not just end up creating yet another bias system that might be prone to misinformation based on who built it and how they view this. I think it does take a multidisciplinary approach and a degree of alignment. We'll never remove bias. Data's still got human elements to it, but we owe it to ourselves to do it in the fairest, most well thought out way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I hope that as people are listening, with just all the details that you and I are discussing just goes to show that it's not as simple as there's this LLM, let's just go use it. And I think, I'm sure all of us have seen use cases where even the recommendations that are given to us by these large language models can be off, right? And so I guess I'd be curious, how can a layperson understand if someone is saying, we're using AI, we've added AI to our app, we've added AI to our telehealth company? Like, how does a layperson say, yay, this is great? Or like, I doubt this? Like, what are the questions that someone can ask themselves to understand how to validate whether or not this is helpful and also how it affects their privacy?
Oh my gosh, that's a really, really difficult
I don't even know if there's an
question.
answer to this. So I will just tell
Yeah.
you, like, I'm not saying you must have an answer to this.
I'm just trying to think of what I would do in this situation because I feel like I always fall on the side of being very skeptical when someone's like, oh, look, we've got AI in our app. Fantastic. But what's your AI supposed to help me with? And what's it supposed to inform for me? It can be anything ranging from a set Q&A where you've only got the options of pick these 3 choices and we'll give you an answer. Now pick the next 3 choices. I'm okay with that because that's a preset. I know kind of what to expect. I know what I'm walking into. If it's a chatbot and an open text type of format, I'm always a little more skeptical.
Okay.
Purely because, and this is even in general AI models as well, I have a rule of 3 approach. It's very commonly known that AI does something called hallucination, which means sometimes when it doesn't have the response you need, it does its best guess to fill in the gaps and give you what it thinks is the best response. Now, if you ask the same question 3 times, that might end up meaning you get 3 very different answers because it's filled the gap in 3 different ways. So for me, when someone says AI, I'm like, I'll use it. I'll be very careful with my personal information, but I'm going to test you and ask you the same question 3 or more times. And I want to see the answers that you give me. If there's a degree of consistency between the answers, okay, I can now see that you're pulling from a known source, that you're not having to fill in too many gaps because there aren't that many. You've got a core information source that you're pulling from. And I have a level of confidence that, okay, if you vary that much, it shows me that you don't have the data source that it can pull from over and over and over again, which means where is that little piece of information coming from? Are you giving me a best guess to fill the gap? Are you finding random pieces of information and factorizing it in some way to fill the gap? And that kind of puts me off. The other thing I like to ask these chatbots and apps as well is, okay, if this is what you're telling me, can you give me the source from which you got it?
I do the same thing.
It's
I was like,
great.
I don't believe you. I sometimes get mad at it. I'm like, I don't believe you. Give me the source. I even say
Exactly.
tell me how certain you are of what you just shared with me. I even ask that, and then it starts, and I'll click on the sources and I'm like, this is not even correct.
Exactly. See, but it's such a small hack and we take it at face value. But I think there's so many times where I've caught it and it's given me a dead link, or a link that takes me to a study that's not even related to the question that I asked or the answer that it gave me. And I'm thinking, okay, now I think I want to do my own due diligence, my own way independently. But it's little things you can do, not necessarily to trip it up, but to show yourself that, okay, I have a degree of faith in this and that it was built on founded information, not just enough information. And it's being taught to fill in the gaps with whatever it can type of thing.
Okay. And awesome. Many have asked, if you could have your dream in women's health, what would it be? And I'd be curious on your reaction to this. It would be, you take the conditions that impact women differently, the ones that impact women disproportionately, and the ones that impact women uniquely. I would then understand the disease burden. So that would be the economic burden plus the number of people that are impacted. And I would do a prioritization based on that. And then I would look at what are the clinical trials that we have to date and what are the questions we have answered to date and what are the gaps in knowledge, and literally build an entire funding model for women's health. And then I would layer on, for anyone who has diagnostics and treatments on the market, I would want to analyze them against the data and their own studies to be able to say, this is what would actually work, and maybe even personalize it to the individual. Wouldn't that be so cool?
I love that. I love that, especially that you said personalization at the end. I think I love that approach to discovering new therapeutics, but also optimizing what we already have, because you've put the right lens on it. You've put the right filter on it to make it truly relevant. And the one thing I'd add is train it on something that fully understands female health and physiology. So kind of rolling back to where we started, that fertility to thyroid link, thyroid to microbiome link, microbiome to other conditions link. Create this map of female physiology where it understands every level of connection that we've unearthed so far. And they're still coming out. There's still so much new research there with how microbiome impacts things and all that new stuff and DNA sequencing, all of that. Build a layered model of what it is to be a woman and then link that back to the health. That's your inset and instep to personalization. So I absolutely love that space, and I could talk about it for hours, but it's something I'd love to see in AI, because I think it's going to be a big game changer, especially with things like discovery and optimization in the future.
Yes. Well, then, as you were talking, the other piece I missed is the FDA reimbursement models, and then what happens at the patient-doctor visit. Because I'm seeing that, like, there's part of this endometriosis working group I'm putting together. There's actually a group that is going to be connecting with the FDA so that we can have better alignment around how the FDA approves anything for endometriosis, because so much of it is based on pain and there's much more to it than that. And so there's going to be discussions just on that layer, but then also reimbursement, like how payers really reimburse? Because I think the way it's looked at now for these various conditions, again, everything is siloed, right? It's all like the endocrinologist does this. And for the things the endocrinologist does, this is what gets reimbursed and what gets paid. But we're like a whole person. And Peter Attia has talked about how we need to get to healthcare 3.0, where it's like really looking at this systemic piece,
Exactly.
right? But then also the data shows that it takes 17 years between when guidelines are set for it to become clinical practice, which I'm still trying to understand why that takes so long. But I'll give an example here. So genitourinary syndrome of menopause is something that impacts women, obviously, in their perimenopause and menopause years, but even women who are put into surgical menopause. And those types of symptoms happen often when people are on like birth control or after they've just had a baby. And those guidelines were just put in place. But I wonder, does every doctor know? Like, does everyone get an alert in their electronic health record to say, oh, this patient is in one of those areas. Read these new guidelines. This applies to said patient, right? Or the patient being able to share they're having said symptoms. And so the doctor now knows, okay, this is happening, right? Like that. So there's like all of these pieces that are missing. And again, I know we're getting detailed here, but I think it's important for people to just have perspective because you and I have talked about the systems that are missing, the systemic thinking, but also within even given topics, the hundreds of layers you can go down to make sure something is done right. And this is not at all intended to be scary. It's more of an appreciation of, yes, we're all frustrated, but there's a reason why. And it takes a lot for it to get to a better place, right?
Totally agree. And I think that comes down to also standardizations and ways in which the information is disseminated. So if you think, particularly in US healthcare systems, everyone works on a different system. Different clinicians might be using, different tools to find the latest research. It's not necessarily standardized from state to state or between hospital systems as well. So now it becomes the case of how do we fairly, disseminate this information? How do we get it into all the systems in the right way so that whoever's accessing whichever flavor of this system has the same information, has those core guidelines, but then also within that system, how do we start to pull in patients and their list, their information and their symptoms to either alert the practitioner or when they come in, when they put that information into their system to ask the query, what could this be? It also alerts them. It becomes that kind of proactive within the system as well as reactive within the system to get ahead of this instead of, I'm going to go back 6 or 7 times with the same symptoms for only then for it to be looked at seriously to look at the deeper level of, well, what is the cause? Not just, we've treated the symptoms, you're good, go away, come back if it comes back again.
Yep, absolutely. As a consultant, one of the things I've seen is so many people spending all this money and time on trying to create these changes. But if we don't have the right structures and incentives behind it, change doesn't happen. In our healthcare system, who is the person that owns all of this? So then I will go back to this and I'll just say this is, don't we need also AI standardization? Like who's the governing body to say, check, this one meets the standards? Do we have that? Do we need it?
It depends on how the AI is applied. So this is its whole own very niche space of classification, which becomes, are these AI tools considered software as a medical device or AI as a medical device? And now, that's literally just coming in with the FDA very, very recently. They do have rules, they do have guidelines, they do have, ongoing auditing requirements to implement these things. But as AI evolves so rapidly, it's very, very hard to keep it standardized because there's so many different versions of the AI. Now, for example, if you have an image-based AI, which is looking at reviewing radiological data, would you put that in the same bucket of software as a medical device as an LLM, which is just, for example, summarizing new papers so clinicians can easily digest rather than having to spend so much time reading? They can get the quick read and then go deeper if they want to. They can pick and choose the studies that apply to them. How would you review these two completely differently as AI or software as a medical device? So I think it's there in terms of general intent. But as these tools evolve and become more and more niche within the medical space, there's going to be different guardrails for each one, and we might have to kind of split them out rather than keeping it general. But I will say there are some really good standards around making sure these things are audited, that any model that is implemented doesn't drift, so it still works within its guardrails. So we're there with the thinking, but we're going to have to keep evolving that level of safety thinking as we go.
Okay. No, that's wonderful. Thank you. By the way, I had no idea we were at time. I was like enthralled in this conversation, so I want to respect your time. So what I'll do is I would just love to get your closing thoughts, then we can end. So Niki, we have covered so much of AI. We've gone down rabbit holes. We have talked about, the dream of what we hope would happen in the healthcare system, the reality of what we need to take into account for women's health. I guess, what would your parting words be for those who are listening as to, like, I don't know, the future of AI, what you're hoping to see, and anything else that you would like to add?
Yeah, we've covered quite a lot today. Quite a lot.
It wasn't my intention. I just
No, but I love
couldn't
those
help
kind
it.
of organic conversations where you can just talk about everything. For me, AI has got a huge part to play in the future of healthcare on so many different levels. One, from truly understanding the human body, like I said, personalization, and to call it what it is, digital twins, understanding yourself on such a level of everything from your genomics all the way up to the environment that surrounds you and how it impacts you. That's something I'd love to see to give us our own visual understanding and deeper learning of how we work. On the clinical scale, for me, I think AI is the future of clinical trials, but it's going to be very, very stepwise. Number one, we're going to have to teach it, how do we design the best trial? What does the best trial look like when we're trying to achieve more unbiased data sets, more valuable data sets, more diverse data sets? Then we come to the engagement piece that enables both clinicians to interact with this data as an LLM and individuals as well for their own health. I think we need to put safety in place. We need to actually connect the data in the right way to make the AI super informative, but also accurate and really reliable. I think that's the next evolution for us. And then as individuals, learning how to use the state of AI right now in a way that's safe for us, but also that we can trust and we can do our own checks and we can do our own balances, and seeing how that evolves over time. And as a whole, I think AI just in both preventative healthcare as well as treatment-based healthcare coming together, that's the dream for me, where you have the whole pipeline from what can I do to prevent this? What action can I take early based on what I understand of myself through, okay, I've been through this transition in my life. What does this mean for me going forward? What else can I do? And create that loop of I'm in control of my whole health, and I know as much as I want or need to know to do that.
That's awesome. I really appreciate that you said yes to this outreach, and you clearly are the right person to interview. You're incredibly thoughtful and balanced, and know this space incredibly well, and you're so data driven. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise. I know we will get a lot out of it, and I hope everyone calls you, but doesn't make you too busy to help them build AI.
Thank you so much. Absolutely loved the conversation.
What did you think of this conversation? For me, the biggest takeaway is that AI isn't the enemy. The real danger is leaving women out of the data. And if this episode gave you something to think about, please share it. Send it to your group chat, your colleagues, even your doctor. We need more people aware of what's happening right now in women's health and technology. And as always, thank you for being a part of this community. Together, we're asking the hard questions and creating the change we need. Thank you for joining me today on Fempower Health. If you'd like to continue the conversation, please follow me on social media. I am most active on Instagram, LinkedIn, as well as TikTok. You can also subscribe to the weekly newsletter if you want to stay off social media to get the latest and greatest updates. And you can find a link to that either on my website, fempower-health.com, which is a hub to all the different health topics I've covered over the past 5 years, or you can go to the show notes where there's links to all the helpful resources that are relevant to this discussion. And if you know of someone in your life who would benefit from this information, please do pass this along, because that is how we can ensure this important information reaches those who need it most. And for anything that is discussed medically, please understand that none of what we share on Fempower Health is medical advice. It is all for information purposes only, and only a conversation between you and your doctor can give you the care that you need. Thank you very much.